Okay, hi, and welcome to chapter 2 of The Power of Babel by John McWhorter. Chapter 2 is called The 6,000 Languages Developed into Clusters of Sub-Languages. So, as you may recall, the last chapter ended with me telling you that, according to McWhorter, there's no such thing as a language. A controversial thing to say. As he puts it, I quote, viewed up close, most languages are actually bundles of variations on a general theme, dialects. Page 52. So dialects are the only thing that exist, right? For several reasons, often geographical or political. One of the dialects of a language ends up being considered the standard one, right? However, there's obviously no objectively default German, default Arabic, or default French. There are simply variations understood by more or fewer people in one region or another, right? Okay, great. So, how do dialects arise? As mentioned again, the last chapter, they arise gradually, right? As the speakers of a certain language disperse and end up in different geographical areas. Italian and Spanish, to take an example, were once merely dialects of Latin before being considered separate languages altogether. Okay, note the word considered, because although we tend to think of, say, Spanish as one language, right? South Americans, with the exception of Brazil, they're well aware, and probably Brazilians are well aware, they speak Portuguese, but they're well aware that there are variations of Spanish, right, among the different nations of South America, not to mention within Spain itself. Right? So again, we go back to that thing I mentioned in the last video in chapter 1, that these distinctions, right, these demarcations, these whatever you want to call them, categorizations, these you name it, right, they are there. They're a double-edged sword, right? They help us understand by breaking things down, right? But at the same time, they do not tell the whole story, right? So when we say, Spanish is a language, we tend not to think that, someone from Mexico and someone from Chile, right, may disagree. So back to English. You might think that English, right, at least where it started in Britain, may actually be an exception, right? And in fact, it isn't, right? It isn't. Okay, I know this may sound strange because, English speakers can understand each other for the most part, right? There are differences in accent, differences in proverbs, right? Sayings. Some words differ, right? Americans say trunk, British say boot. But for the most part, English speakers can understand each other. It's not a problem. Okay. So, what am I saying here? Okay. Let's look into this. So, let's go back to Old English, right? A Proto-Germanic language, Old English. It spread across the island, right? What is today Great Britain. And dialects of Old English sprang up before one was considered the standard. Okay, as we said, often politics or geography come into play here. Okay, even today, not only do accents, as I mentioned, and pronunciation differ across regions, but words, phrases, and even grammatical rules may be different, right? Again, there are no objectively superior or inferior dialects, right? Only a default one that for whatever reason was considered the default one. McWhorter claims that, and I quote here, along these lines, as often as not, a language comes into existence split into different dialects from the very beginning, right? There never having existed any single original variety. Page 59. So when it comes to language, change quite often has to do with chance, right? And the last point I want to make here is that although there are standard and non-standard dialects, there is in essence no such thing as bad grammar, right? What is often termed such is merely different from the standard variety, not inferior, Not wrong, just different. And language is there to allow and ease communication. And as long as that's happening, a language or dialect cannot be declared inferior. Okay, sorry for the interruption. I had a bit of a coughing fit. I had the virus, got it on New Year's Eve. So even though it's been, 25 days? I'm recording this on the January 25th. Still have a bit of a lingering cough. Anyway, let's move on. So many languages have more varied dialects than English, especially American English. And why is that so? And I mentioned in the last chapter that we'll talk about the importance of writing. So when the United States was becoming a country circa 350 years ago, two factors ensured that it would not change much, that the language would not change much. The first, of course, was the printing press. Excuse me. So when words are stored on paper, right, people subconsciously develop the notion that this must be what's right, right? Not only that, but printers themselves, right, they were also forced into making a conscious decision, right? It's not feasible, even in this day and age, to print an article in Australian English and New Zealand English and South African English and English and Irish English and Canadian English and American English and Scots English, right? It's just not practical to hire a journalist from each dialect. That was certainly true 350 years ago. So printers at that time, they were forced to make a decision, right? They had to ask themselves the question, which dialect would reach my audience, right? Usually the greatest number of people, or at least the greatest number that can actually read, right? So for practical reasons, as I've just said, only one dialect could be published at any one time. The second reason is education, right? So shortly after that, universities flourished. And at universities, even today, and it was certainly true back then, right? The standard variety, right? The default dialect dictated by whatever, power, geography, politics, whatever it was, right? Whatever the standard was, it was the one that was usually taught at universities. So because of its association, that dialect's association with learnedness, right, more people are often willing to adopt what they're taught formally by incorporating what it is they're listening or reading into their own language. So in our day and age, radio, television, social media, so on, intentionally or inadvertently, they all pull us in certain linguistic directions, right? And McWhorter also clearly mentions the fact that language mutation, as we have known it thus far, is very likely a thing of the past, right? At least in developed societies, right? In societies where literacy is high, where writing is pervasive, most likely we will not see the relatively rapid change that we have observed in past centuries, right? The aforementioned aspects of modern society, the written word, education, and the various media for consuming culture, they've all but guaranteed that language change will be, if not non-existent, certainly far slower than what it once was, right? And change is less likely to be severe, even down the centuries. At least that's what McWhorter is arguing. Okay, let's move on. So back to his rather controversial argument, right, that there's no such a thing as a language, only a dialect. This is, he argues, because what we now call the standard language was once a dialect that happened to be at the right place at the right time when a country was becoming well, a country, right? We tend to assume that um, Italy was always Italy and Greece was always Greece, unless you're an ancient historian or something. But we tend to forget that nationalism is a relatively recent phenomenon, mostly, at least in Europe, taking place in the 19th century, right? Um, so the tendency is to assume that the main dialect, right, meaning the language that is spoken today in whatever Italy, Greece, France, was the one that first came into being, right? That all the other varieties simply sprang up when that seemingly initial dialect became more relaxed in terms of rules, right? So just like Latin, it started off very rigid, right? Declensions and you name it, and then it relaxed as time went on into French. Same thing with English, right? It started off, you had so many different plural endings. At some point, English ditched all of them, and well, almost all of them, right? We still retain some exceptions, oxen, children, etc. We've ditched all of them except for the S ending, S-E-S, I-E-S. But that's not necessarily true. Okay, that's the point that I now and I want to focus on here. That in reality, it all comes down to chance, right? At the end of the day, it comes down to chance. Um, let's refine that more precisely. It often boils down to who was in power when a centralized government was taking shape. That's basically what it comes down to. In addition, this tendency sometimes goes further. Okay, and I quote here. In some cases, the standard dialect is even deliberately fabricated by picking and choosing from several local dialects. Page 65. So, sometimes, as is the case of Finnish, right? In Finland, the central government aimed to please more than one group, and the result is an artificial amalgam of a dialect. And sometimes dialects may be dismissed early on in their history as inferior, only to resurface at a later time as the dialect of the educated, the elite. At other times, dialects that are mutually intelligible are, for whatever reason, classified as different languages, right? Also, just as a language may start out with little influence and then become the standard, the process may happen in reverse, right? What was once considered a distinct language may become marginalized to suit usually a political end. So all of these things, can happen, and that's where the chance thing that I mentioned before comes into play, right? No one can anticipate. We know what may happen, right? We just don't know when and where and if it will happen, as I mentioned earlier. So as McWhorter states, and I quote, this cycle eloquently demonstrates that in the end, dialects are all there is, right? The language part is just politics, exclamation mark. And that's on page 71. Lastly, not only can dialects of the same language be deemed separate languages, but in some cases, languages as distinct as French and Spanish can be classified as dialects of the same language, right? In this case, Latin. So as you can see, change may happen in any direction, and this continual change means that a language never sits still long enough to deserve being called such, right? To deserve being called a language. It's always an ideal, right? When we say language, it's always an ideal. So yeah, that's the point he's trying to make, right? Because it's always changing, because of all these factors that I've just mentioned, right? One day you're the standard dialect, the next day you're not. Sometimes, you're stitched together from different dialects. You're never really a language, right? Nothing is really a language, strictly speaking. Linguists, grammarians, etc., they try to pin down languages in books and so on, but change ensures that language, as we understand it, will forever, remain an ideal, right? Dialects are all there is. Oof. Okay. Adding to the messiness of all this phenomena is the fact that even if the world had no geopolitically drawn boundaries, right? So if we're living in an ideal world where, hey, I don't have a country, the entire world is my playground, okay, there would still be no easy agreed upon way of gauging where dialect ends and a language starts. Okay, I've talked about this previously. Okay, you don't just wake up one day and say, haha, my dog is officially now, my puppy is officially a dog. Okay, he, she, it has made that transition, officially, and you send everyone a message telling them, please stop referring to Rex as a puppy. He is now a dog, right? It just happens. Okay. Um, and yeah, and same thing here. Okay. And this difficulty, right? So even on its own, it's difficult, but this is compounded by the fact that sometimes speakers of language A consider their language the same as language B, while speakers of language B consider language A to be a separate language, right? Sometimes this has nothing to do with boundaries, right? It has something maybe to do with culture, right? Calling two similar dialects the same may suggest a sense of belonging, right? When a sense of belonging is unacceptable or unwanted, right? In many cases, however, even an objective linguist cannot make the call for many of these tricky distinctions, right? Are, for instance, Lebanese Arabic and Syrian Arabic the same language, or are they dialects of one, right? And how far do you need to go from, say, Lebanon before, right? So let's say you consider Lebanese Arabic and Syrian Arabic the same language, not dialects, right? How far do you need to go? Jordan, before you classify them as different languages? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, right? There's no consensus, right? Spanish and Portuguese. What about British English and Scots English, right? Technically, all of them claim that, the official language is English. But are they the same? And how much discrepancy should there be between two dialects for them to be treated discreetly, right? Separately. 10%, 30%, 70%? There's no agreement among linguists. As McWhorter puts it, quote, speech varieties differ from one another along a continuum on which no definite signpost can be placed, distinguishing where dialect stops and language begins. And that's on page 80. The final reason the author argues why there is no such thing as a language, pristine and frozen in time, is because languages continually bleed into one another, right? That's his word. I put it in quotation mark. Bleed. So a lot of languages now have English loanwords, right? And English itself is no stranger to borrowing words from other languages, having in it, German, French, Arabic, and other loanwords. Making distinctions is harder when two languages that borrow from each other or from a common source are very similar to begin with, right? So McWhorter informs us that, and I quote, "This is not rare. Linguists encounter dialect continua, as it's called, all over the world." Page 81. In fact, some speech classified as merely two separate dialects is more distinct sometimes than two varieties classified as languages. Interesting. All right. We move on. It is also worth noting that though some dialects, like the Scandinavian ones, may seem almost mutually intelligible, right, to a non-Nordic person, perhaps, who looks at them, he or she may think, well, I'm sure, person speaking language A can understand person speaking language B. They may not be so. Okay, on paper, these languages may look similar, but let's look at Danish. Danish, for instance, has altered more than Swedish and Norwegian, especially in terms of pronunciation. So this makes it difficult for a Swede or a Norwegian to understand what a Dane is saying. Okay, but this does not mean that a Swede and a Norwegian understand each other perfectly, and vice versa, right? Although Swedish and Norwegian sound similar, the roots of many words have taken on different meanings over the years. McWhorter puts it succinctly when he says, and I quote, "Certainly dialects that are not close on the page will not be mutually intelligible. But then, when they are close on the page, they may or may not be mutually intelligible." Page 85, right? So if they seem the same, right, they may be understood by the speakers of those different languages, but they may not, right? But obviously, if they look different, right, they're different, right? The speakers aren't going to understand each other. So this furthers the argument that language, in the sense of a need, compartmentalized, agreed upon, fixed, pure set of words, is at best an ideal, right? And more often than not, as the author argues, non-existent, right? Last point. Just as there are bilingual people in the world, those who speak two languages, obviously, there are also people who speak two or more dialects of a language, right? This phenomenon is called, I believe that's how it's pronounced, diglossia, right? But don't quote me on that one. Anyway, diglossia from the Greek meaning two tongues. Arabic is a prime example of this. The written standard Arabic, right? The Arabic that started out, 1,500 years ago or so, called Fusha, right? That is reserved for reading and writing only, right? And that is understood, right? From Saudi Arabia all the way to, North Africa. Pretty much everyone, every Arab country can read and write in this. However, all Arab nations, right, from the scorching deserts of Arabia to the sweeping sands of North Africa, they have their own dialects of Arabic, right? They speak differently from each other. So all of these, right, the spoken dialects and the formal written variety are all misleadingly lumped together, right? And they're called Arabic. And although an overlap of words, obviously exists across all of them, they often need to be learned separately, right? So this trend is set to increase, and not just in the Arab world, because as formal education continues to reach more people, the local dialect that people know will become insufficient on its own. And at some point, if this trend continues, everyone will have to learn the standard variety, in addition sometimes to their own local dialect. So ends chapter 2. In chapter 3, we'll find out how languages mix with one another. Thank you very much. See you in the next video.